So, as one of the resident Haruki Murakami YouTubers, a question I get asked a lot is where should I start with Haruki Murakami? I think that can be kind of a tricky question to answer because he has so many books. And I think depending on where you're coming from as a reader will sort of determine where you should start. So, if I were me starting over again, this is where I would start. So, after looking through all of his books that I own, I've kind of come to the conclusion that there's three that would be a good entry point for you to start with. The reason I picked these three is because I think they are three of his best books, and I don't want you to start off reading this incredible author by reading one of his kind of subpar books. So, with that in mind, these are kind of the three entry points that I think make the most sense. The first entry point that I think makes a lot of sense and is also the first book of his that I read is the Wind Up Bird Chronicle. This is a book that a friend lent to me while I was in college, and I was trying to get back into reading. I didn't really know where to start, and I opened it up, and I was a little unsure at first, but by the time I got maybe like 50, 60 pages in, I was like, what is this? Haruki Murakami's writing is something that I don't think is replicated in most places. There's only really a few other authors that I've read that even bear a little resemblance to how he writes. And this book, I think, is, if not his best, kind of like the one that all the other ones look up to in a way. And I think it's sort of like the defining book of his career. I don't know if it's necessarily the one that has sold the most or that people recommend the most often, but when I think of Haruki Murakami, this is the book that I think of. The Wind Up Bird Chronicle is about a man who loses his cat. His cat is missing, and then sometime later, his wife is missing, and hijinks ensue. I don't really want to say much more than that. And it's not even necessarily that I could spoil it for you because his books are so meandering and non-linear, and there's kind of a lack of traditional plot going on that I don't think I could really even spoil it if I tried. If you're reading Haruki Murakami for the first time, don't go into it expecting like Act 1, Act 2, Act 3, because you're just not going to get that. It sounds a little counterintuitive because this book is split into multiple parts, and so are some of his other books, but I think those divisions are kind of just incidental based on like the time that things are happening in the book. You know, you're not going to get like in part one, the mystery unfolds, and then in part two, that's where the action comes in, and then part three is when it all wraps up nice and tidy. It's not going to happen that way, I can tell you that right now. But with that said, I think a lot of the best qualities of his books are present in this one. It's funny because, you know, if you read enough of his books, you'll start to notice kind of some continuity in the themes that he talks about and kind of his style. I know I've mentioned this on the channel before, but there's even a Haruki Murakami bingo card that you can fill out for any one of his books. I'll put it on the screen here so you can take a look at it. But if you read this without having read kind of any of his lesser books or even some of his other really good books, I think you'll kind of get the gist of what he's about. And at least for me, this was enough to hook me and get me to read literally his entire bibliography. So not a bad place to start at all. I think another really good potential starting point for you could be Norwegian Wood. And the reason I say that is because I think out of all his books, if I'm not mistaken, this is the one that has sold the most. It's also his book that kind of broke him out into the mainstream, at least internationally. I know he was famous in Japan before this came out, but when Norwegian Wood came out, that's when he kind of started to gather a international fan base and kind of turned his fan base into what it is today in a way. As someone who talks about Haruki Murakami a lot, there are people from all across the world watching my videos, which is really cool. And without this book, you know, maybe he would have become even more famous later, but this is the one that kind of let the world know who he is. The other reason I think Norwegian Wood is a good place to start is because it's one of Murakami's least fantastical books. His books are filled with a ton of surrealism and sort of magical realism in a way. A lot of stuff that just sort of doesn't make sense in the real world. And Norwegian Wood is a little esoteric. It's got some kind of strange stuff going on. But for the most part, Norwegian Wood is a book that's pretty straightforward. It's mainly just about the relationship between three people and kind of the love and strangeness that occurs between them. There are hints of what comes in his other books inside of this, but for the most part, if you want something that is not going to break your brain too much, but still really compelling, this is a great place to start. I will say that it's one of his more depressing books, I would say. Not all of his books are like a giant bummer, but this one in particular is kind of one that is going to make you feel some things, much more so than his other ones in a way. So if you're someone who like listens to Phoebe Bridgers, great book for you to pick up. The third book that I think is a good candidate for you to start with as a fledgling Haruki Murakami fan is Kafka on the Shore. There is a great video that I think Ted Ed did about this book that can kind of give you an introductory course into what it's about and why Murakami is important as an author. The reason I bring up the book is because it's just one of his best ones and kind of similar to Norwegian Wood and kind of similar to Wind Up Bird Chronicle. I think this one has a lot of what makes his books great and kind of what you'll end up seeing in the rest of his bibliography as well. With that said, I think Kafka on the Shore is kind of a completely different flavor of Murakami than Wind Up Bird Chronicle or Norwegian Wood. I think sometimes people like to boil down his work into being this kind of monolithic thing that all sounds the same or all reads the same, and I don't think that's the case at all. Kafka on the Shore kind of has this almost like whimsical quality to it in a lot of ways, and since the protagonist follows a young boy for a lot of the story, I think you're kind of getting a different narrative experience than you would reading Wind Up Bird Chronicle or Norwegian Wood. Both of those books kind of feel much more adult in a way. And not to say that there isn't adult stuff going on in this book, because there definitely is. But with that said, the two main perspectives that you're getting from this book are a young boy and an old man. And I think that's just kind of a cool place to, operate in while you're reading it. I think trying to pick a favorite Haruki Murakami book is hard to do. It changes from year to year. And I did do a video talking about my favorite Haruki Murakami books and how I would rank them. But with that said, I put that video out quite a while ago at this point, and I think the rankings have kind of changed. At this point in my life, I think Kafka on the Shore might be on top. I'm definitely due for a reread, but this one, for whatever reason, I think has some of the most rereadability out of all of his novels. So, if you're new to Haruki Murakami, I think this is a great place to start, and I think it's a great place to restart once you've read the rest of his books. And I think coming back to this will let you see, like, yeah, it was all there from the beginning. So, Kafka on the Shore, not a bad place to start either. Once you've started reading Haruki Murakami, you might think to yourself, where do I go next? I think there's a lot of books that you could read second or third in his bibliography. I think you could start with any one of those three that I mentioned and then move on to the second and third one that I mentioned. But with that said, the second Haruki Murakami book that I ever read is this one, Hard-Boiled Wonderland and the End of the World. And the reason I bring this one up, aside from the fact that it's just really, really good, is that if you're just now getting into Haruki Murakami, I think reading Hard-Boiled Wonderland and the End of the World is a really great move because Murakami has a brand new book coming out, at least in the US and the UK in November, called The City and Its Uncertain Walls. And I've kind of tried to stay away from spoilers as much as I can. But with that said, from what I know about the book, it seems to be set in the same world as Hard-Boiled Wonderland, and that's super exciting. I think Hard-Boiled Wonderland is one of his books that's like often under-discussed because it came pretty early in his career, and it didn't have the same impact that like Norwegian Wood and A Wild Sheep Chase had. But with that said, I think it's one of his most unique ones and one of his best ones too. I think it's the closest he's ever gotten to writing like a true sci-fi novel, but it's also super fantastical in the same way too. I think Haruki Murakami in his own way is kind of like his own genre, But at the same time, he has sort of delved into different areas throughout his career. Like if you look at Dance 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 or Wild Sheep Chase, those are kind of detective novels in a way. And Hardboiled Wonderland and The End of the World, I think, is really genre-y. In some ways, it's like the most Murakami he's ever been, and in other ways, he's never really even come back to something like this before. So the idea that his new novel is coming back to this world is super exciting for me, and I hope to see him sort of delve into the wackiness of this one again in the new book that's coming out. It's hot in here. I don't know if I've mentioned this before, but I live in Arizona, so I apologize for the sweating. This is like June and it's 117 degrees out, so I apologize for the kind of grossness that you're seeing right now. The last thing that I wanted to mention is kind of where you shouldn't start with Haruki Murakami. Um, I think what you should absolutely leave is like your last one to read, or maybe near the end of the list of books to read, is 1Q84. This is one of my favorite books by him, and there's a reason for that. I think it's kind of like Haruki Murakami maximalism in a way, just because of how large it is and how broad the scale is. But with that said, if you're someone who is on the fence about Haruki Murakami, I don't think that book's going to do you any favors. I don't think you're going to walk away from 1Q84 and be like, that's the one that did it for me. Now I get it. I think in a lot of ways, 1Q84 is kind of like just for the super fans of Haruki Murakami. Everyone I know that has gone into Haruki Murakami with that book has kind of come out being like, what was that all about? But with that said, if you're someone who's already into him, I think 1Q84 is kind of like his zenith in a way. Like it's him sort of like throwing everything he has against the wall and seeing what sticks. And it doesn't mean it's a perfect book. If anything, it's kind of like his shaggiest and the one that probably could have been edited down a lot. But whether for music or books or films, I kind of like to see masters of their craft really just going for it. And much in the same way that I'm looking forward to Megalopolis coming out by Francis Ford Coppola, I think 1Q84 in some ways is similar. It's someone near not the end of his career, but later in his career, just really going for it and making something that I don't think a lot of people even asked for, but he wanted to make it anyway. So I definitely wouldn't start with 1Q84. If you've read like Kafka, if you've read Wind Up Bird Chronicle, Norwegian Wood, even if you've kind of gotten into the weeds with him a little bit and read like South of the Border or After Dark, even Killing Commendatore in a lot of ways is a better place to get to before you get to 1Q84. But once you've gotten through all that, once you've decided like, all right, I'm in, this is a great place to go, and I hope you'll get as much out of it as I have. So yeah, that's where I would start with Haruki Murakami. I think there are a number of ways you could get into it. I think that the books that I mentioned aren't even necessarily the definitive ones of where you could start. I know the Haruki Murakami fan base and sort of avid readers are a really diverse bunch of people, and so don't take my word for it when I tell you where to start. There's plenty of other people on the internet who talk about him too, and so go check that out as well. These are just my picks, and that's what I would do. That's it for today. Again, I apologize for the sweatiness. I hope it is cooler where you live than where I am here. So thank you. Check out my other videos if you want, and have a great day. Bye.